Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Ferguson. I'm the Vice President of Content for Strada, and I'm very glad to have you here at our state showcases. These are the sessions where sort of the rubber hits the road, and we've got two amazing people here from the great states of Virginia and Minnesota to talk to you about their experiences. Wendy Kang from the Virginia Office of Education and Economics is talking about employer alignment, but as I think we all know from this morning's presentation and the general work that we do, that one focus area is never really one focus area, and there are tentacles into the other areas as well. So I'm sure we'll be talking about a broad range of things, and Nora Morris will be talking about clear outcomes. So we're going to have Wendy start us off. The way we're going to do it this morning is there's going to be like an 8-minute TED Talk style presentation by each, and then we're going to just open it up to Q&A, and hopefully we can have a really good mutual conversation because no one likes to be talked to for an hour, so we want to hear from everyone here as well. So Wendy, if I may, I'm going to introduce you briefly. You're the Executive Director of the Virginia Office of Education Economics. You were formerly the lead legislative analyst for education at the Virginia Senate and Finance Appropriations Committee. You have broad knowledge and experience in higher ed finance, workforce programs, and policy evaluation, and you've held leadership positions in several higher education institutions in the great state of Virginia. You are here to help us understand the interplay between education, workforce development, and policy, in addition to many other things, I'm sure. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning. How is everybody? I am going to stand because we were told it's a TED Talk, so I feel like standing is the way to go. So I'll first start off and ask a question. What if you lived in a state that set a goal to be the top state for talent? Would you want to live there? How many of you live in Virginia? Raise your hand. Only a few. Okay. Well, I'm from Virginia. We've set that goal, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why. And of course, one of the first reasons that we know why we need to do that is the number one thing that we hear employers say is that they need the talent to fill the jobs that they need. And we hear that for economic development if employers want to come to Virginia or if they want to stay in Virginia, that they really need to hear a clear message that we are focused on talent. And that's one of the reasons why we've looked at this top state for talent goal. But the other one is what we heard a little bit about today was we need to help students figure out how to align their education and workforce needs for economic prosperity for them as well. So really this focus on top state for talent is twofold. It's for our businesses, it's as well for our students, and for our economy. So we have a few strategies that we are employing, and I'll just kind of highlight two of those today. And one of them is data. So I am housed in the Virginia Office of Education Economics. We are a fairly young organization. We were formed in 2021 through legislation. We are with the Economic Development Partnership. So that is the entity that is in charge of bringing in businesses to Virginia and to work with them. So we're not in education, we're not in the labor market group. We kind of get to sit in between. And we've been given a charge to really look at both of those components. How do we align education and workforce? And how do we do that through data-informed discussions? And have asked to kind of be a data translator, or we heard the term intermediaries this morning. How can we be an intermediary for that? So we're still young, so I'll talk to you about a few foundational things that we've started to do using data to really help think about that employer alignment. And a few of those are just really trying to make data more transparent and accessible. And we've developed several dashboards that focused on high demand occupations and being able to go in and query data based on regions of the state that are divided up either by economic and workforce development regions or even by education regions for the K-12 system in our community colleges. So you can really dig into data and be able to see it depending on what stakeholder that you are. We've also created another dashboard that looks at supply and demand alignment. Again, you can look at that from a state and regional perspective, whether an education provider or maybe a workforce provider, to really look at what degrees are being produced in that area. Where could there be gaps? And we're not just doing it with degrees, we're also surfacing credentials. We're surfacing credentials in K-12, in the community college system, as well as registered apprenticeship programs that are out there. So really trying to provide a perspective of all the different levels of education that can be provided. There's also been other work that's been done looking at college and career outcomes. So what happens to the psychology majors? #1 degree in Virginia. Maybe probably the #1 degree in most of your states as well. What happens to psychology majors and what jobs are they going into? So a longitudinal study that looked at all degree majors, what was the first job and what was the second job? And that helps us think about how we can talk to students about where the jobs may be, but also when we have employers asking questions about how do I get more people to fill the jobs, the skills aren't aligned, we say, wow, we just noticed that with the computer sciences, that engineering degrees, 25% of the workforce for computer science was being filled by engineering degrees. So how can we get employers to think about diversifying the education degree individuals that they're seeking? So we're using a lot of tools and data to make that transparent. And I do want to give credit. I am coming into this job. I'm now 3 months in. But we have some phenomenal people who are now at Strada, Heather McKay and Todd Oldham, who really built a lot of these data and these dashboards. So we've worked on transparency. And the next thing that we're really focused in on is how can we translate that? Because one of the most important things is people say these dashboards are great, but what does that mean? So our next goal is really to be, how do we use that data to start conversations? And that kind of moves into our partnerships, because we want to leverage the partnerships to find out ways that we can bring the employers and those institutions together to find out what's going on. Our good example is we just found out by looking at some data that 50% of our engineers are going out of state. And we don't know why, because we already have a lack of engineers in Virginia. So there's two questions that come to mind that we can now leverage by going to talk to employers is saying, you know, what is happening and why aren't you hiring some of our students in Virginia? How can we get you to recruit more from our Virginia schools and maybe keep them? Or what are the challenges you're facing? And then we can also talk to our higher education institutions and say, why are students leaving the state? And use those data to drive discussions between those two and even potentially bring those entities together to figure out solutions. And then translate that to maybe some policy options, either locally or at a state level. And that's the unique part about us, that we've been charged also to be looking at recommendations and policy options. And so we're really looking at how can we just move to that next level and use all the data that we've now been able to put together. So I talk about partnerships, that's one with the engineering, but Virginia in the last 5 years has really been heavily focused on ways that we can really focus on talent. We created a Secretary of Labor role about 5 years ago, before we just had a Secretary of Commerce and Trade. That Secretary of Labor is just charged with actually thinking about labor force needs and meeting the needs of employers. And so we've really tried to kind of get that leadership in place. We also created a new state agency that aligns several workforce programs. Many of you out there may have heard the proliferation of workforce programs that are across multiple agencies. We tried to centralize some of those, not all. But we've also implemented monthly meetings across the agencies to talk about workforce needs. And it actually is happening. And we were on a call Monday, and we were sitting there talking about ideas related to work-based learning across 8 other agencies. So we're not just saying we're going to do it, but we're actually putting it into action. So we're working on more partnerships within the agencies and being very intentional about that, and have implemented strategies. And one of the last things I want to mention that we're doing is really thinking strategically across all of the areas about how we can align our strategies. So just this week, we were reviewing the strategic plan for our Chamber of Commerce. And we said, how can we have them put strategies for this top state for talent that we have into their plan? And they're doing it, and we're talking with them. Our State Council of Higher Education, which is the SHEO for that state, for our state, they're on their strategic plan. How do we put the strategies for top state for talent there? And we created 3 or 4 ideas where we can play a role in helping with program alignment and helping with their program approval process. And then we've also got our economic development partnership with the Top State for Talent. And we're using all of these different plans to then say, well, if we all have the same strategy, then we'll all move together moving forward with these Top State for Talent ideas. So as I wanted to kind of note is, we're using the data. We're going to start working on driving those partnerships and using the data to drive conversations. And then we're really strategically thinking about how we can work both with employers and with education providers to align some of those ideas. So those are some of our ideas, but I'll also be happy to answer additional questions and also hopefully hear a little bit about what you all are doing as you're asking questions and sharing those, because I am always a person that's looking for new ideas as well. So thank you very much, and I think it's time to turn it over to Nora.
Thank you, Wendy. That was great. And keep those questions in mind because we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A after. Nora Morris is the director of the Minnesota Statewide Longitudinal. I practiced this at home. It's such a hard word. Longitudinal, I'm going to say it fast. Education Data Systems, AKA SLEDS, which I like much better. SLEDS pools data from multiple state agencies to explore pathways from K through 12 to higher education training and employment. Nora spent her career using large data sets to help people and organizations better understand complex systems. The good news for us is she presents to audiences who have very limited experience and comfort with data. And I think even if you're a data nerd, like the best of us here, you can always learn something from people who understand how to talk about data. So, Nora Morris.
Good morning. And greetings from the North Star State, where it actually is finally feeling like fall. 2 weeks ago, I was swimming in the lake. It was 84 degrees. It was very weird, but welcome. So anyway, let me tell you a little bit about SLEDS. It's our state longitudinal education data system. If you say it enough times, it gets easier. But we like to keep the education in there because that's the cornerstone for us, and so it's SLEDS. I just want to let you know we also have an ECLDS that is my partner, my sister agency, and they're dealing with all of the data around our youngest Minnesotans. So in SLEDS, what we do is we pull together our data from, we generally start in 3rd grade because ECLDS does everything from birth on up. So we have information from grade school, high school, once you passed high school into higher education, and that can mean anything from your traditional university to a 2-year college to, we're working on expanding this, but on non-credit credentials, we want to capture as much as we can of that work-based kind of learning. It's not all in one spot, unfortunately, like the higher ed data, so it's a bit of a puzzle to find all of it, but we're working on that. And then we pull that together along with our UI wage data so that we can really look at the whole trajectory of students. Let me tell you a little bit about how I ended up in this area. When I was just a baby data scientist, before we even knew there was such a term, I worked in health services research. And what we did was, national guidelines had just come out around how physicians should be treating certain conditions. Before that, everyone was sort of on their own, or they read the New England Journal and gathered what they could. But for the first time, there were really standardized practices that the experts in the field said this is the way to go. So I was with a small nonprofit, and we pulled together all this information, gathered it into reports, and went out to physician groups and showed them their own data compared to the guidelines and then compared to their peers. So I want to kind of summarize into 3 groups the kind of responses I received. The first was what I call the fear and denial response. The physician leaning over the table and yelling at me of, who am I to tell him how to practice medicine? Yeah, that was one response. The second response was kind of the status quo response, where it was, oh, that's very nice, great little charts. We'll think about this. And of course, the report would get shelved and they would go on merrily doing their business because systems are hard to break. The status quo is always the easiest way to go. And then finally, there was the third group of people that we worked with, and by the way, they were not evenly distributed. But the third group that we would work with would be the group of physicians who would say, wow, we really look like that? I'm glad we're doing some things right, but this is kind of surprising to us because we thought we were better. But when are you going to come back? Because we are going to implement all these systems, and we want you to come back and measure it again so we can show the progress we've made towards improvement. And my whole career has been built around how do we get people from fear to status quo and on into embracing data. Well, again, it's data science. And as we know, the scientific method is you start with a question. You don't just go out and gather all kinds of information and then just start, trying to make sense of all sorts of information. What you do is you start with a question. And Strada has helped us with some of those questions. So the questions that we can answer with SLEDs are things like rigorous course taking, what we used to call college prep. The AP classes, the dual enrollment, et cetera. We measure all of that, and we look to see who's got access to that, who's participating in that. Do our rural students have the same shot at that kind of experience as our metro students? That helps us answer some of those questions. We gather the data so we can do that. And then we look at how many of our high school graduates are going on to some form of post-secondary education. How many are staying in state? How many are leaving the state? Those kinds of things. So again, we can look at who are we serving well? Who are we not serving well? And I can tell you, Minnesota takes its education system, it takes great pride in it. We're often ranked way towards the top. They look at the AP scores, et cetera. We're always first or second. We're right there with Massachusetts all the time. But if you start to drill down, it's not such a pretty picture. There are huge gaps. We have the largest educational attainment gap in the whole country, 50 out of 50. That's not a place Minnesota's comfortable with. But without the data, we wouldn't know that. So the other question we have then is, as we know, the ROI. So somebody does go on to college. What does that do for them? What kind of return is there for a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, a credential? What difference does it make if you go to each institution? What sort of program leads to better wages? And we have all of that available now. So outside of just the questions, there's the pieces about the data. How do you take data and information and actually work with real live human beings to get them to use that when they're making decisions? So one of the things we know is just in time. I always joke with my staff about we have to have just in time data. Well, our data's really lagged, so it's not really just in time, but at least we try to make sure that the data is easily accessible. So all of our dashboards, and we're not unique in this, but it's important for us to remind ourselves why we're doing it. All of our dashboards are always available on any kind of mobile device. So if a student is thinking about something at 2 a.m. and wondering what to do, they can pull up our dashboards and they can look at the results for what happens if you make different choices around different majors or different institutions, et cetera. So it has to be available to them at all times. It also has to be visually appealing, and by that I don't just mean it kind of looks pretty, but we really need to work with our data visualization experts and neuroscientists to figure out how does the human brain really absorb data? How do we make our numbers? I'm a numbers person, but I have come to realize most people are not. So how do we take those numbers and make them into something that people can absorb and understand intuitively? That's something that we're always working on. And then finally, we really need to drill into the data, because the one thing, and we need to provide all of the filters, because the one thing that neurologists and neuroscientists have told us is the human brain processes data through stories. That's why I started with my story of my early career. That's where they need to be able to see their own story in our data. They need to be able to drill down by their institution, their high school, their region. They need to look at by demographics, by race, ethnicity, by gender, by disability status, to see, well, that's great that that's an average outcome or an aggregate outcome, but what would it mean for me? And so they need to see their own story, because when they can see their own story, they can start to trust the data, and only after they trust the data will they start to incorporate that into their decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. I appreciate it. We are going to pass the mics down now, so they will be in the audience, and I encourage you to raise your hands if you have questions, and the mic holders will find you.
Hi, thank you both so much for that. My name's Emily Rounds. Sorry, I'm over here raising my hand. Emily Rounds, I'm with Third Way, a center-left think tank here in DC. Really appreciate the work that you all are doing. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the barriers that you face with working between so many different state agencies and groups. I think that what both of you are doing is really impressive, and there could be barriers in other states. So how do you overcome those to really make that collaboration happen, to make the best resources possible for policymakers and the public?
Sure, and that is my job. It's a partnership organization, a partnership project. I am housed in the Office of Higher Education, but we work across all of our we have 8 data contributing state agencies. So again, that transparency and that trust, we used to have a different memorandum with each of our different agencies, and it wasn't like purposeful, it's just that they all came on at different times, and so we would write a new one. But one of the projects that we undertook over the last year was we came up with a master umbrella agreement. So every single agency understands the rules of the road, what data we collect, how it can be used, how we keep it safe, and everybody is playing by the same rules. Because without that, we didn't have a huge problem, but there were little undercurrents of, well, how come they get to do that? So we did a lot of working with lawyers, et cetera, to just being transparent and laying out the groundwork, and always reminding. I've always been fortunate that I have worked in very mission-centered organizations. So reminding people, we're all here to serve Minnesotans, and that usually works.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about is things that we're also implementing. I think one thing I might add is just the value of relationships and relationship building. We have a one-term, 4-year governor, and the leadership changes every 4 years. And so, at least in Virginia, I've found we really need to build a lot of relationships and need to talk to a lot of people to maintain those relationships, to figure out how to eliminate the barriers or mitigate the barriers. And that is, one example. We were just working on this credential alignment project, and we had our contacts at one of the institutions, and they're really busy, and they've got other things that they need to do. But we also knew we had the state charge to get it done, and we're on a deadline. And so, what we did is we kind of knew there was another group that was talking about this and raising the importance. And then, I nicely found the leader of the organization. I said, hey, we're really working on this project, and we know this is actually going to help you. What is it that we should do? Like, do we need to set up a call with you first, or how can we explain this? And, we quickly came up with a solution. So it's really trying to think strategically about relationships and partnerships and leveraging them when you need to, and even finding champions within an organization that can help you bridge to the next one. So, if you've got somebody in the community college system that really is good working with their chambers of commerce, and you've been trying to reach out to the Chamber of Commerce, use that person to try to bridge over and make the introduction, because they're a trusted resource. So a lot of it is that networking and relationship building, so that we know who to call to kind of help keep things moving and continue to find ways to build partnerships.
I'm with Heartland Forward, and we're an economic think and do tank focused on the middle of the states in the middle of the country. And I'm just curious how you all think about the challenges with rural students And if you are looking at them differently than maybe students in the cities, and specifically what the data is around that and how you're addressing those challenges.
I'll start first in terms of what we're trying to think of in terms of the education and workforce alignment. Some of the things that we've seen with the data for the rural areas is that we know that population is declining. We see students and the fear of if they get a higher level of education, then they're going to leave that area, and what's the driver for them to do that? We've tried to really think about working with those regions, because we know those regions are actually trying to put into place ways to market to their students that they could come back home and work remotely and make partnerships with businesses there. And so we're trying to leverage practices that meet what those regional economic needs are and find ways to kind of bridge that and build partnerships with education institutions and also with other entities to kind of think of ways that they can retain their talent in their area and also attract them. So I think it kind of goes back to the relationships, but also really looking at each individual's regional needs and trying to figure out kind of where they are and how we can help get them to where their goals are.
Yeah, I would say we, like I said, we always include filters so you can drill down into each of our economic development regions, et cetera, because it's like most states, we have our large metro area, and then we have the Iron Range, and we have, a lot of very smaller areas out in the state, not smaller areas, but smallly populated areas out in the state. And although many of the things are the same, and we always look for, again, do they have access to all the same programming, et cetera. But there's also some unique things. So we are currently working with Minnesota Department of Health. We allow access for outside researchers, and the Department of Health is one of those, and they are looking at what are the predictors of somebody who's getting a license in some sort of mental health providing. What keeps them outstate? Is it the fact that they grew up in a rural area? Is that what keeps them out there? So we're trying to look at how do we ensure that there's a workforce out there. And like every other place in the country, we are also looking at our early childhood workforce, because that's a huge issue in our rural areas. Without good childcare, you don't have young families, and without young families, you are destined to disappear.
Morning. Vincent Ginsky, Director of Workforce Competitiveness, North Carolina Chamber Foundation. This is a question for our neighbors just up north in Virginia. I'm curious a little bit of the origin story of how you guys really got started. What were the reasons driving the creation of your organization? And then I'm really curious about the positioning. Why out of the EDP? It's something our General Assembly says with some frequency. If you want to get a commerce function done well, you don't go through commerce, you go through the EDP&C. That's not a judgment as much as an observation of what elected officials in our state say. And I'm just kind of curious, the origin story, why you guys got created. And then second question is, how long is your leash? How free can you be in making new data products?
Okay. So our origin story, I actually, I've worked in Virginia for almost 25 years now, and I have kind of been in different roles within a kind of always tangential to workforce, whether it's higher education or looking at workforce programs. And we were one of the things that from day one when I worked on I worked in kind of a GAO for Virginia JLARC, and I had to do an evaluation of workforce programs. And the biggest question was like, what are the workforce needs? And like we were trying to ask somebody, and nobody knew the answer. So that was my first intro to that back in 2001. And as I kind of progressed through my career, it was always that underlying question. And I think it was about 6 years ago, I was at the State Council of Higher Ed, which is the SHIO for Virginia. Stephen Murray, so current, is it CEO? Is that what it's President CEO of Strada, was in the role at the Economic Development Partnership. He serves as an ex officio on our CHEV board. We had made a deliberate choice back in the McDonnell administration about 12 years back that the SHIO should always have the Economic Development chair, a president, sit on the board. And through our council discussions, again, it was why are you approving these programs? These are not high demand. But nobody could really say what high demand was as this independent group. And so we always just knew there was this lack of pieces here. And so we actually did a report that was collaborative with BEDP, and it's issued. It's on the State Council of Higher Education website that really just kind of highlighted the need to have an entity for that. And then we had members of our board in partnership with the Economic Development Partnership. And then this is that relationship building. We worked very closely with several members in the General Assembly, and we got the legislation through. And because it was both education and an economic development partner lobbying for it, I think that was how that legislation moved through. And so the rationale for having it in the VEDP was to kind of putting it in the middle. And I will say, I mentioned that workforce agency that we created, and I was over at Senate Finance. The original bill wanted to move it to the new agency. And, ironically, I was in that position. I said, no, we spend a lot of time really thinking about keeping it because we constantly have administration changeovers. So sometimes it is really what the nature of your state is. But because we have administration changeovers and there's always a leadership change, we knew that stability would be lost. And so we fought very hard to keep it and preserve it in the Economic Development Partnership. So that's a little bit of the origin story. The second one is, how long is our leash? I think that's an interesting question. I am trying, as we're being asked to do more, to say, if you want us to do that, to really say, put it in the budget, or we have an advisory group, a research advisory group that was formed. It includes the Secretary of Ed, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Commerce and Trade, the Money Committee staff, which is very important in our state given the changeover and the leadership, and then the State Higher Ed Council, the SHIO, and then I might be missing one or a few others, but we've got a couple others. And we use them to guide our work. And so we can go to them and say, what is it that you need? And if we've got general consensus, then we feel we can move forward. I think the one area that we'll be really trying to navigate is, how do you make policy recommendations and not look like it's advocacy? And how do you do that? And I think that is, that's our next step. I did work in an organization that was more like that GAO for Virginia, and we had to do a lot of that in a nonpartisan sense. So I think we're really going to try to look at kind of, how do you highlight things and say, here's some policy options, and not be, you have to do this or it's not the right way. So we can give members of the General Assembly or administration options to consider within a range. But we're always citing data and evidence or practices or what we're hearing, and just translating all of that to help them make decisions. Because often they'll just say, you just told me there's a lot of problems with all this data and I don't know what I need to do next. And they really just want options. So, maybe we come back in a year and tell you how that's going, but that's kind of our initial plan.
Good morning. My name's Brooke Kyle. I'm from the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. And thank you both for your expertise on the data and reporting. I wanted to ask about the consumer-facing sort of data and reports. How do you measure that they're actually being used and that they're actually being utilized by the stakeholders that they were built for? What sort of data do you collect? How do you get that, you've spent all this time and energy building it, that it's actually getting used?
Well, I can take a stab at that. So in Minnesota, we gather some information on our website analytics, like everybody does, but that's very gross figures. It's hard to really tell who's using it and how. But we have, as part of our sleds, we also have a data coaching network. So we have service co-ops spread throughout our state. All of our economic regions have a service co-op, education service co-op. And we contract with each of those co-ops to provide a data coach. And what that data coach does, it's never anybody's full-time job. It's sort of folded in. They're either the CTE representative or something like that within their co-op. So they work with each of their schools and districts directly. And as part of that, we meet every other week, and we all share stories, and we share best practices for who are you meeting with, how are you getting them to look at the data, what sort of changes are they making based on that data. So again, we have the stories to tell for how our data is being used. We also know our policymakers use it. So for example, we knew for sure that there was, as in most places, there was a big disconnect between where our white students and particularly our Native Indian students were as far as enrollment in college. And that was then used we have now created an Indian scholarship program for students in our state. And we will also use our data system then to evaluate the impact of that. So it's not so much just website analytics, because we have that, but that's not particularly helpful. So it's more, like you said, the relationships and the stories and the working with people.
I like that data coach idea. I'm stealing that. That's a good one. I think I've heard of those. We've been talking about it, so we can talk after. I think we were still a little bit new, and this is that next stage. And some of our work is going to be a little bit maybe more on the policy maker side. And so a lot of our measures of success are, are we seeing legislation that's reflective of that if we provide these policy options? So I think we're kind of thinking of what are our metrics for success. We are going to be working in some K-12 on the CTE credential alignment programs. So I think one of the things we've been talking about is what metrics of success do we set up for whether it's a report we would create or other things that we do, but also that other piece we've started to talk to in our phase 2 is the data coach component, just to have some general knowledge.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Melina Kennedy from Indiana, and I was curious, in the Virginia example, you were talking about how the new agency is, these are my words, but almost like protected from sort of the leadership changes. Is that, if that's what I heard? Is there some, and I believe you are a state agency, is there something that you have in place that really helps with that is legislative? We've had in Indiana Governor's Workforce Council, and it's under one administration, then it goes away. So I'm curious what you guys have done to have that longevity between changes in leadership.
Yes, we are housed in the Economic Development Partnership, which is designated as authority, and I think we only have 3 authorities in Virginia. One is the Economic Development Partnership. So the governor can appoint the board and the board members, but he doesn't have full control of all the board members. There's actually some standing members of staff of the money committee on that. And so the board is hiring and firing the CEO. And so when we were thinking about the establishment of this office, we really were looking at the few entities that exist in Virginia that have kind of that aspect where, as a governor comes in, your leadership is not changing. The other one that we have that does that is our SHIO. They have a board. The governor appoints the board, but that board is the one that hires and fires the leader for that. And that's similar to our higher education institutions, which unfortunately there's been some news about that, but that's a topic for another day. But we thought about how to put it, and I don't know if in your states and your state specifically, if you have that type of entity that's set up, but that's where those creative solutions can come in. I think I've heard some work too where you've got your chambers really kind of standing that up, but then you're trying to figure out how do you get the leadership leverage to work with those state agencies too.
Well, we're running out of time, but I really have a question that I want to ask. So if you can answer it quickly, it's on the topic of challenging data. Enhanced wage records. It may sound like a boring topic, I know, but it's actually generating a lot of interest and action. And I remember our prep call, you both had interesting things to say about enhanced wage records, shocking as that may sound. So I was wondering if you can both maybe just offer some comments on the importance of enhanced wage records and how, this kind of powerful data can help things. Nora, why don't you start?
I'm really quick on this one, so let me tell you. So I did discover in Minnesota, we have our wage records enhanced in ways that some other states don't, in that, for example, we have location of employment. So if you are working for Target, we know if you are in Target in Minneapolis or Target up in Duluth or wherever you are. We know that. It's not all pinpointed to Target headquarters downtown Minneapolis. So that's kind of cool. We also have the wage rate and the number of hours, and that has helped us tremendously. We're now starting to build out a high school report looking at if you don't go on to college, what sort of wages do you earn 5 years, 10 years, all of that down the road. And then lastly, what we don't have, but we're on the cusp, I heard the other day, is we are going to be getting some sort of job title, occupation, something. So, like I said, we know where you're working if you work for Target. What we don't know is if you're an accountant or on the sales floor or stocking shelves, or who knows. We just know that you're working in retail at Target.
So we are still in the development phase for this. So this is an aspirational piece, and I'm a big fan of trying to get more access to data. And we'd even tried about 5 years ago, but there's this thing called COVID, and they were upgrading the UI system, and we were really late and getting out payments, and they just said phase 2. So the good news is that the contract has been signed to get us started on that. And my understanding is we are going to be getting more of what Minnesota has. I think that's a to be determined, and we'll have to figure out how we can kind of keep that moving and try to have more access to that, because that is something that we think it will be incredibly valuable in terms of the data that we can have access to.
Terrific. Okay, thank you so much. That'll be the final word. Wendy, Nora, thank you so much. Thank you, you guys, for your great questions.